The following presentation of the Eric McKenna Project is sponsored by no one.
Hello, you're listening to the Eric McKenna Project.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I first want to tell you I have so enjoyed the podcast. I'm probably 15 episodes in, which is not a lot considering the volume of product.
Oh, you're just starting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I did the most recent ones too because I want to be as relevant as I possibly can. But I'm also about 100 minutes in on the 4.5 hour audiobook.
Yeah. Cooperation, coercion. Yeah.
Yes. So, talk to me about that book for a second, but the first thing is you have a fantastic voice, and I noticed that you didn't read the audiobook. So was that did you consider doing it? Was it an idea? Did you want to?
Well, that's interesting. I would have been happy to read it, but it was kind of out of our hands. We have a publisher, and the publisher contacted us shortly after the book came out and said that an audiobook company contacted them and said they wanted the rights to do the audiobook.
Wow.
And so it was completely out of our hands.
Okay. Because I thought that you and James would do it together.
Right.
And I said, but maybe Antony's, because he has that voice, and he'll probably read it. And then I saw it was a narrator, which is fine because obviously those folks are professional at what they do. And
I was very happy. I thought the narrator did a great job.
No question. Yeah, and it's very interesting. But before we even get into the book, though, can you give some basic background information on yourself?
I'm Antony Davies. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University, the Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. I'm co-host with James Harrigan of the podcast Words and Numbers, and as you mentioned, we just recently, I shouldn't say recently, about a year ago, we came out with our first book, Cooperation and Coercion, which you can find on Amazon.
That's the voice, friends. That is the voice. How did you and James get connected?
Pure serendipity.
Okay.
I was putting on a weekend seminar for students at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And
your alma mater, by the way.
That's my alma mater, right. And I had a number of faculty lined up to give lectures in economics and history and philosophy, political science. And at the last minute, my political scientist dropped out. So I contacted the people that were sponsoring the thing, and I said, look, I've lost my political scientist. Do you have any suggestions? And they said, do you know James Harrigan? I said, I don't know James Harrigan. Well, it turns out Harrigan actually taught at St. Vincent and lived like 2 miles down the road from me. We had never met.
Okay.
But this was maybe, 10, 12 years ago. And it was just, love at first sight. We met each other and we said we're gonna work together. We don't know what we're gonna do, but we're gonna do it together.
Okay, and that started from a lecture.
Yeah,
a joint lecture that you had to do.
Yeah,
and the podcast came first. Before the book.
No, what came first was we took our lectures on the road. So we go, and to this day we go to high schools throughout the country giving lectures on economics and government.
Recently, on one of your more recent podcasts, there was one.
Yeah, we were at Truman State and Kirksville High School in Kirksville, Missouri, and we did a lot. While we were there, we did a live recording of an episode of Words and Numbers, and it was so good. We thought that the content was good, and then the subsequent Q&A with the audience was so good, we made the Q&A into an episode also.
And we're going to be everywhere, Antony, so I apologize. It's what we do. It's conversational.
No, this is great.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay, yeah, it's everywhere. It's just, there's nothing standardized about what I do here, so bear with me bouncing around. It seems like in today's environment, what you're doing and visiting universities in general, unless they're very specifically picked out, it seems like walking into a potential hornet's nest.
Well, yes and no. First off, it's not universities, it's high schools that we're doing. And the universities are much more reluctant. It's harder to get into universities
I would imagine.
to do what we do. High schools, particularly AP level economics and government teachers, are desperate for anything. And so they're very happy to have us. Most of the places we do are public schools, and we'll do in person maybe 30 to 40 schools a year, and then remotely we've been doing on Zoom as well, maybe another 100.
Wow.
In a school year, yeah.
Wow. So during the pandemic itself, did you do a lot?
Oh, yes.
So Zoom was a good outlet.
Zoom was great.
It was a content outlet, especially because, as I would imagine, all the high schools were dying for content outside of, because they were trying to figure out.
Yeah. And these poor high school teachers, what happens is they'll get a directive that they have to have an AP Advanced Placement course in economics. And, the principal, stuck between a rock and a hard place, will say to the, history teacher, okay, it's all yours. He says, what am I supposed to do with this, right? So we've been very fortunate to meet some really good teachers and to be able to help them out a little bit.
What have you found talking to high school students?
Now, that's fascinating. What we have found is that this whole conversation we have in this country about we need to spend more on public education, whatever, is nonsense. We have been to some of the richest high schools in the country. And by richest, I mean high school campuses that look better than most college campuses we've been on.
Right.
And we have been to the poorest, and I mean literally, we have been to the second poorest county in the country, gone to their public high school. And what we have found is rich, poor, the quality of education doesn't track with the wealth. What it tracks with is the teachers, and to a large extent as well the parents. If you have parents who are committed to education, supporting the teachers, and you have teachers who are excited about teaching and excited about their students learning, you get great things happening in the classroom. Now, of course, the money helps, no question.
Right.
But that's not the driving factor. The driving factor is those teachers.
The teachers union in this country is huge, a very powerful lobbying group that raised a lot of money. How any pushback from teachers unions?
No, nothing there. We really don't get much pushback. I think once in the 4 or 5 years we've been doing this, we got a little bit of pushback from some parent looked up our pedigrees and said, these guys are free market crackpots and I don't want them in the school, and made problems with the principal, and the principal kind of had to smooth things over, this kind of thing. But here's the thing. We're very particular that when we talk to students, not even students, but when we talk on words and numbers, or you see it in cooperation and coercion, it's nonpartisan. We aren't making an argument for or against
That's what I enjoy about your
party.
show.
Yeah, we're making principled arguments that you begin from a perspective that I think almost everybody would agree with, that I own myself and you own yourself. And if you agree with that, let's follow that logically and see where it ends up.
Okay.
And sometimes it ends up with conclusions that you should leave me alone, I should leave you alone to do our own things. And sometimes it ends up with conclusions that, no, we need a government here to stop you or to stop me from doing things that we're doing. And so it's getting that balance right that's the thing that we talk about.
Which I think would be fantastic to introduce that kind of advanced thought to the high school level. I think, do you find that those kids are starting to really formulate their own opinions? Because at that age, obviously with junior high and senior high, you're still hearing generally your parents and your family's thoughts on things. And a lot of it has to do with where you're raised and the environment you're raised in. That's a formidable time, and it's interesting to have those conversations, I would think, at the high school level as probably before they would get to college.
It is interesting because one of the things we find this with the high school kids, but we also find it all the way up through adults, is this sense that government is a magic wand, that if you've got a problem, all you need to do is pass the right legislation and things will get fixed. And so one of the things we talk about is, look, government is composed of human beings. It's no more nor less magical than the marketplace, which is composed of the same human beings, right? And there are pluses and minuses on both sides. There are things that they'll get right. There are some reasons why systemically they'll get it wrong. And so we talk about this, and it's eye-opening for the students on two levels. On one level, that it runs counter to the story that they've been told, that, well, the government can fix anything. And it runs counter to, I guess, the nature of young people is to see the world in black and white. And so either markets are good and government is horrible, or government is good and markets are horrible. And we open their eyes to the reality that actually there's a plus and a minus on both sides. It's not either or, it's both and.
Okay, so a couple things to unpack there. Is what you describe, this mentality that's there, is this a recent phenomenon, or maybe more accentuated recently, the past 5, 10, 15 years?
Oh, the mentality of government as the magic wand, or the mentality of
that and life's black and white?
Oh, the black and white, I think, goes back to the dawn of time. It's just built into teenagers. They're idealistic, right? And so they see the world this way. In fact,
they care.
And this is one of the things I teach statistics to college students.
Right.
And one of the hardest things is, statistics is the antithesis of black and white. It's entirely shades of gray. So getting them out of that black and white thinking, I think that's a normal thing for young people.
Okay.
But this other business about seeing government as a magic wand, I think it's something that's gotten worse over the years. And I think it's gotten worse over the years because of a kind of a horrible feedback. And this horrible feedback is, on the one hand, politicians would love for voters to think that government can solve any problem, because so long as you the voter, believe that government can solve any problem, I, the politician, can campaign on that and say, look, you elect me and I can fix this thing, right? And of course, when I don't fix it, the next election comes along, I say, well, but the problem wasn't my ideas. The problem was the guys on the other side of the aisle.
Of course.
And if you just elect me again, we can get this sorted out, right? So that's that's part of this. But I think part of it is we have a media that is not, understandably so, is not focused on delivering news or delivering truth. They're focused on selling advertising. Mm-hmm. They're businesses. That's what they do. And how do I sell, if I'm a media organization, how do I sell advertising? I show things to my viewers that they find titillating, exciting, scary, because that will bring them back.
Okay.
If I show you good news, you're not going to come back and look again. And so I don't sell advertising. And so consequently, you get this weird kind of feedback where the media has an incentive to show us the world through the worst possible lenses. Things are horrible, they're getting worse, all of this, and that gets the voters all riled up of, oh my God, the world's going to hell. And then the politicians can step in and say, I can fix that because government fixes everything. And you get this interplay, and it's not I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. It's not conspiracy theory at all.
Right.
Rather, it's simply human beings responding to the incentives in front of them. The politician's incentive is to get elected. The media's incentive is to sell advertising. And lo and behold, this is the outcome you get.
And those incentives have probably changed in their delivery based on technology.
Yes.
And I think that's because when you talk about news, I think we're roughly the same age. So Dan Rather, maybe Ted Koppel, but even going further back than that, some of the quote unquote iconic news deliverers, and you had 3 channels, right? ABC, NBC, and CBS. And my father used to make a comment to me. He would say, son, it was always about business, and there always was a liberal slant to the news. And my father was kind of straight down the middle. But he goes, there always was, but it wasn't in a way that brought caustic behavior in the public generally.
Right.
Until election time, and a couple months before a major election, there'll be an issue or two which will drive, or a war or something. But it wasn't daily, and it wasn't on the public conscious. And that's probably directly related to technology, right?
Yeah, I think with with technology, a couple things happen. One is we can see the news, anytime we want. We've got it 24/7. And the other thing is there's no time to pause and process. When our news came in the form of daily newspapers or a half-hour news segment once a night, you had 24 hours to process what you read. And conversely, the people who are writing the news have 24 hours to think about this and get it right and put it out there.
And getting it right was a thing at one time.
Getting it right was a big thing, exactly, yeah. And now there's none of that, and so we don't reflect on the things that come to us through the news. Instead, we react to them.
Okay.
And I think that's part of what feeds into this, that we engage in the news on an emotional level rather than an intellectual level.
And they know it.
Right, yeah, exactly.
and I just can't imagine that. In the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, that the purpose of the editor of a certain news show, daily news show, the thought in their head was, how do I get a reaction out of the viewer? It really more geared towards presenting the truth and the facts, and it wasn't about spicing it up and looking for that hook. Now everything from every nuance of every delivery, from the newscaster to the inflection of the voice to the sarcasm to the exuberance of a certain philosophy, it's all packaged in a way like it's your best friend sitting on the couch telling you what you want to hear. And it's that echo chamber is the worst way to consume news, right?
And it's very subtle. You're talking about this is reminding me. I work for, I don't work for, but I'm associated with Foundation for Economic Education. And anytime it's mentioned in the media, it's mentioned as a conservative think tank. Right. It's not conservative, right? But it's mentioned as a conservative think tank. And I notice this because if you look, anytime a think tank is mentioned, it'll either be a conservative think tank or a think tank. And that's very subtle, but it's a dig at one side that isn't applied to the other.
That labeling thing.
Yeah.
That's I love what you do in this podcast, and in so far in the book. It's anyone can read your background. It's extremely impressive, but to the and what is the phrase you use? Interested non-experts.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would pretty much label me. I'm very interested, but reading your background is very intimidating. And when you see the word economist, statistics, a lot of people can tune out because they assume it's well over their head, and I'm not going to be interested in that. But the approach you take is really about looking at current events and how the economy and how statistical data plays into the way the news is delivered, how we're so, quote unquote, terrible word, but we're kind of like triggered over certain things we hear, and that causes us to react a certain way toward each other. And I think that is fascinating, especially in the climate that we're in right now. You're never going to run out of material. Right,
exactly. Well, I think this is one of the things that people think that have this tendency to think that economics is above them. It's this complicated thing. I'm never going to understand it. And economists don't help with that when they start throwing up graphs and talking about marginals and elasticities and all this. At its root, economics is about human behavior. It's about explaining what happens when humans who have unlimited desires bump up against their limited abilities. And when you start thinking about economics from that perspective, it's something that anybody can understand because we live it on a day-to-day basis. When I decide to buy the hybrid car versus the gasoline car, and I'm considering the effect on the environment, I'm considering the effect on my wallet and all of this stuff, that's economics in action right there. And we get this at a gut level. What economists what too many economists tend to do is pull that away from the human being, pull the humans out, and make it all about mathematics and graphs and complicated stuff. And yeah, that's an interesting way to think about economics, but at its root, it's about humans. It's about you and me and what we do.
And the decisions we make.
Yeah, yeah.
And what really resonated with me even last night when I was into your book was the concept, which I think is, for whatever reason, is not really, I don't know, it's not real prevalent in society today, and that is the concept that every action has a consequence.
Yeah.
And you talk a great deal about that with lots of examples, but I want to dive into that a little bit if we could.
Yeah, and again, this is something that we all understand from our own behavior, that if I choose to do something, there are consequences to that. And every time I make a choice, I'm actually making two choices simultaneously, because I'm choosing to have this thing on the left, and I'm simultaneously not taking the thing on the right. So if I choose to take the bus, I'm choosing not to drive. If I choose to drive, I'm choosing not to take the bus. If I choose to order the pizza, I'm not choosing the stromboli. And so every choice we have is like that. It's simultaneously a choice for one thing and not something else. And we have this tendency, and I'll go back to politicians, and they're very happy we have this tendency to not take that lesson and apply it to government. And so when a politician says something like, well, elect me and I'll give you free college tuition. Okay, but that comes at a cost. If you want free college tuition, you're going to be giving up something else. Maybe you're going to be giving up less social services to pay for this, or maybe you're going to be giving up less income because we have to have higher taxes to pay for this, or maybe you're going to be giving up price stability because we have to have inflation because we're going to print money to pay for this. And politicians never, and understandably so, they have an incentive to do this. They will never lay out the alternatives. They only say the one thing: elect me and I'll give you this, elect me and I'll give you that.
I've always been doing that. From probably as far back as recorded time. It's a promise.
And I think I want to hit harder here, not the politicians so much because they're responding to incentives, but the voters. The politicians can do this because the voters allow them to.
Apathy.
Because, yeah, in part apathy, but in part it goes back to this idea of we react emotionally to the news because there's so much of it, rather than stopping and taking a breath and thinking about what it is we just saw. And if we take a moment to do that, we realize, wait a minute, this thing the politician's offering simply can't exist.
Well, the logic would tell you can't. It's like that concept of funny money now. The public really views the deficit as monopoly money. They view that all because at one point in time, 40 years ago maybe, when you heard the word billion, that was like an astronaut, because you could comprehend a million. It's like, wow, that's a lot of money. But a billion was really something. Billions, when someone sits and thinks about it, well, a billion, they're spending trillions of dollars. It becomes funny money, and it doesn't resonate with the average person on the street because somehow magically things keep getting done with all this money, and I'm somewhat enjoying the benefits of it, and it's not going to affect me. It's someone else's money, right?
Right.
And that really is a flawed way of looking at it.
It is. There's that. There's also this sense that the government has tons of money. Well, it must have tons of money. Unlimited, because it's spending all this stuff, right? And the thing we don't realize is when we say things like, well, okay, we should have, government provided health care. Well, the government's got all this money. No, it doesn't. The only money it has when it takes it from the rest of us in the form of taxes.
Why don't we understand that, Anthony? Where's the disconnect there?
I think the disconnect in part is that we don't see the transaction because it's removed from us. The government spends and it taxes, and we often will see the spending because I can see you're going to give me health care, or you're going to give me whatever it is, a new bus line that runs by my house or whatever. I tend not to see the taxes so much, and the reason I don't see them is because they're hidden. In part, they're hidden in withholdings. that I get a paycheck, but my taxes are taken out before I ever see the money. I think if we had to pay our taxes by writing a check to the government once a year for the entire thing, we would have a very
Some of us do.
a much smaller government. Yeah, some of us actually do. The self-employed have to do this.
Yes, we do.
And the self-employed are very aware of what we're paying in taxes, but most people not, because of the withholding. And
Gasoline tax is a great example of.
and that's the other thing. When taxes are incorporated into the prices of things, we don't see them. And gasoline is the only thing, I think, in this country, maybe that you could find something else.
Tires, I think, is
it's not many.
Tires, yeah.
In which the tax is incorporated. So when you say the price of gas is $3.40 a gallon, that's including state and local taxes. State and federal taxes are included in there. We don't do that with other things. So you go and you buy, you've got a nice lava lamp here. I go buy the lava lamp at a store, and the price tag on it is, $9.99. I take it to
It was more.
I haven't bought a lava lamp in years, right? You take it to the counter, and the price is more. Why? Because they add the taxes. You
Right.
see the taxes right there.
Right.
Another way this happens is with corporate taxes, and politicians know this, and they make use of it. Every politician who says we need to tax the corporations more, what that politician is doing is hiding the fact that he's actually taxing you. Because when we tax a corporation, the money to pay that tax has got to come from somewhere. It's either going to come from customers in the form of higher prices, it's going to come from the workers in the form of reduced wages, or it's going to come from the investors in the form of a lower return. So either way, no matter how you cut it, that money to pay the taxes coming from us, the corporation, simply a pass-through. And so this is one way that politicians can hide how they tax us, by saying we're going to tax the corporation, the rest of us cheer. This happened in Pennsylvania. When was it? Maybe 2 years ago? There was they were talking about a big tax they were going to impose on oil companies. And there was discussion here in Pennsylvania about, what effect this would have.
The oil and gas industry?
Yeah, the oil and gas industry.
I remember.
And the politicians were saying, no, this is not a tax on the consumer, it's a tax on the oil companies. And the thing goes through, and what happens? The price of gas goes up by about the same amount as the tax. Well, there it is.
It's also, in conjunction with that, it's funny how politicians will also try to humanize corporations and turn them into living, breathing entities to sell the idea I'm going to punish them.
Right.
I mean, it's a corporation. It's an institution. It's a function of commerce. It's a loosely held together entity to make money. It's not a living, breathing thing.
No, it's not a living, breathing thing. It's a group of people who've come together to do something. Same way we get together, to form a club or a Friday night poker game.
Right.
It's a group of people doing something together.
And that's a logical, again, it comes back to a phrase that's overused a lot, including myself, and that's the idea of critical thought. 30 years ago, you say critical thought, there would be scholarly people like you. That's where our minds would go. Now, critical thought is just anyone who takes a deep breath, does not react right away, and maybe contemplates for a couple of minutes before they make a decision, because critical thought is lost.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I guess that's probably the frustrating thing that I see, which precipitated us having conversations on this show, was to maybe slow it down a little bit and exchange ideas. And that doesn't happen in politics.
No, it doesn't happen because we're so, and I've seen this repeatedly. I've been a party to this repeatedly. We're so sure that we know what the other person's thinking. So if we're having a conversation and I get the sense that you're on the left or you're on the right or whatever it is, I immediately attribute to you all sorts of things. I understand you now. When in fact I don't. And so I never hear your argument because I've already constructed it in my head.
How did we get here, Antony? How did we get here? Because this is a 20-year phenomenon, 25-year phenomenon, I believe.
Yeah. We got here, I guess in part.
The labeling of it.
In part by not respecting each other. You sit quietly and listen to what the other person's saying. And we don't do that.
Humility.
We're too concerned about what we're going to say.
Yeah, we speak to respond, or we listen to respond as opposed to listening to understand.
Yeah. Oh, I like that phrase. Yeah, we
Right?
listen to respond rather than listening to understand.
I think.
Yeah.
But it comes down to humility for me. It's like if you don't have the basic understanding of even what humility means and how you can incorporate that in areas of your life, humility is not non-masculine, which I think is a problem. I think it's viewed as being weak. I think humility sometimes is viewed by some as being weak, so they don't want to be humble. But the understanding and the back and forth, I am of the belief that most Americans truly don't know. We talked a little off camera about their own personal philosophy, the tenets of what they actually believe at this point in their life. If you ask them, just a decent in-depth conversation, where do you stand on this or that, or what's your philosophy, or what's your thoughts on this? Most of us are not prepared to have that conversation, and I think that's sad.
Yeah, and it's a hard conversation to have. I enjoy that conversation, but it's only because I have spent most of my waking hours over the past 20 years thinking about those questions. Mm-hmm. You got to think about it, and you have to be willing to admit that I was wrong about this. I need to change my thinking. And too many of us, and you see this, I see it mostly in academia of all places.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yes.
I know where you're going with this.
Well, because, what do we do as academics? Our whole job is based on thinking about stuff.
Okay.
And if I've spent 20 years thinking about something and worked out, I understand this thing now, and along comes some evidence that says, no, maybe I've got it wrong here. You're asking me to invalidate 20 years worth of work. So I've got an emotional attachment now to this.
You're gonna die on that hill, aren't you?
Right? Yeah, exactly. And there's a great quote, and I'm going to mess up both the quote and be unable to attribute it to, because I can't remember who said it, but something about science advances one death at a time. As the old guys die off,
that's right. There's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, the new guys can come along.
Yeah, I think there's so much about the lack of humility or even the understanding of what the word means that if you aren't willing to be humble enough to realize I could be wrong, or maybe if you're not even that humble, just say, I haven't been shown another way yet.
Yeah.
If you can't get there, if really you're only convinced that you have, I'm sorry, I'll flip that back up for me. There you go. That's me kicking under the table. Lots of wires down there. I wouldn't want you to look below the table. It looks great up top, but down below, not that hot. I don't think that if you're not willing to be humble and say, hey, maybe I haven't even been shown a different way, use that cop out, because most folks won't even do that. They're so willing to die on that hill, even though they probably have been shown in many ways their philosophy isn't right. And I think we've had that now in the current political climate we're in.
Yeah, well, now politicians I put them in a different category. That their bread and butter comes from having a particular position, and I think it's likely. I've never been a politician, but I can see that a politician would maintain a certain position, even knowing it's incorrect, because he believes his voters thinks it's correct.
The fact that, and I believe you're 100% right, but that's hard for me to hear.
Yeah.
Because at the highest level that's going on, let's just take the Senate. It's going on. People probably have been shown statistical facts, pure essay facts that their belief is flawed in these ways. They won't moderate because that won't get them reelected.
It won't get them reelected. And you could argue and say, look, well, why can't you just be principled and stand up for this? Well, here's the thing. If the voters believe this thing that I don't believe, and I stand up and say, look, voters, you're wrong about this, all that's going to happen is they're going to vote in the other guy who says, yeah, you voters have it right. And so either way, we're going to have a politician in the seat who's agreeing with the voters. My question is it going to be me or is it going to be the other guy? And I think this is one of the negatives. We don't appreciate well enough in this country the negatives to democracy. And the founding fathers understood that democracy was a very dangerous thing, because you're asking a bunch of people, the voters, who maybe haven't thought through the thing or don't have the time or the energy because they're busy trying to feed their families or run their business or whatever it is. And so you don't want people like that who aren't invested in thinking about whatever the topic is, making the decisions. And yet that's exactly what democracy is. So what did they do? They gave us a compromise. And the compromise was the people would elect the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives would be that. It's the people's house. It represents the voice of the people. The Senate would be elected by the state legislatures. And
what happened there?
Yeah, and what happened? We went and broke the thing. We passed whatever it was, a 17th Amendment or something. Someone can correct me on that.
Right.
To call for direct election of senators, and now we've lost that. And I think that may go a long way to explaining how our government has become reactionary to the voters rather than proactive.
I have another idea or a philosophy I've maintained since I was a child, and that was that the framers got one thing wrong, if I can have the audacity to say that as probably a 15-year-old kid. The lack of term limits, the lack of the mechanism to have continual fresh ideas and current thought built into the system to bake it in kind of created where we are now with institutional politicians that are often shown different ways or a correct way of doing something that just will not buy into that. And that lack of fresh ideas, because the country may look a lot different had term limits been a thing at its inception, because I would think that, intellectual people, icons of business, people that have been successful for multiple reasons, science, technology, business, may give 4 years of their life as a service to their country and do this, knowing that their time is limited there. They're not going to find a way to enrich themselves being there. It just would look different. I mean, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is interesting. You talk about, we were talking about people being wrong about things and admitting it, and this is one of the places where I'm happy to admit I'm wrong, and I know I'm wrong simply because I don't have an answer, right? So immediately I'm wrong.
A few people say that to me. Everybody, I love when someone says, "I really don't know."
Yeah, well, see, and I can make arguments in both directions. That's the maddening thing about it. On the one hand, I can argue against term limits by saying that we already have a system for term limits. It's called the election. And if you don't want the guy in office, don't vote him in again.
Okay.
And yet, if you keep voting, in other words, what a term limit is saying is that this person who garners a majority of the votes should not hold office. That seems...
Again.
Okay, but why not? The voters say that that's the one they want.
So back to... This is fantastic. So back to your book, and you talk about government and community, right? And, do we need in government that mechanism to ensure that there isn't corruption because of human nature, to not let the 7-term senator in there? Do we need that mechanism?
And see, this is again where it becomes ambivalent. You can argue on both sides.
Right.
The longer that politician is there, the greater the opportunity for him to abuse his position. But the longer the politician is there, the more experienced he becomes, and the better he becomes at his job. And so you've got this plus and minus on both sides, right?
Yeah, you can make the argument. I don't think it's panned out that way. I am of the belief that fresh ideas, and I think the knowing, the altruistic view of going in there and doing good for 4 years and knowing that now you could it could have been set up in a way you could have run for this office and you can go to a different office for 4 years. You can move around in politics. I don't know how that would look, but
consider, I'm going to give you two more arguments, one on each side.
Okay.
On the anti term limit side, if we have term limits, the power ends up resting in the bureaucracy.
Okay.
The people who work in government who aren't elected. because those are the ones that have the institutional memory. Those are the ones who can be there for 20, 30 years.
Should they have term limits?
Well, that's another question, right? Yeah. Now, an argument on the other side, and the argument on the other side in favor of term limits, I find perhaps more compelling than the other arguments.
Okay.
It's not enough for me to say this is the answer, but it leans me in that direction. And that is what happened. We did not have term limits on the office of president. And we got into a situation where we had Franklin Roosevelt for 4 terms. He was there for long enough that one party ended up controlling all 3 branches of government for a long enough period of time to leave a substantial imprint on government.
The Great Society.
Yeah. And this is the thing, in the Hamilton was concerned about. Hamilton, James is going to get back on me when he hears this because I'm going to get the name wrong. Hamilton, Madison, I don't know who it was, who was arguing against factions.
Yeah.
And the idea of a faction is a subset within the government who's gets power and crafts government to satisfy itself. And the idea of checks and balances was to prevent a faction from coming to power, that whatever power the president had would be countered by the House, which would be, or by the Congress, which would be countered by the Supreme Court. And without term limits, we ended up in a situation where the one party controlled everything and there was no balance. For 16 years, we had no balance of power.
And out of that came a one-party control of the House, the People's House, for decades.
Yeah. And you can say, if you're a Great Society person, you can say, well, that's wonderful because we got the Great Society. We wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. Okay, but you might have gotten something else. And in fact, if you're against the Great Society, you can point to it and say, oh my God, this is what we got because of a lack of term limits.
It is now.
Yeah.
What's the biggest misconception, do you think, when it comes to economics? When I understand we talked a little bit about the pushback. It's just it's over my head. I don't want to think about it. It's a huge mistake because it's so vitally important with everything from what you hear on the news to how you buy your groceries, how you buy a car, how you buy a house. And the house is another thing where sometimes the taxes get blended into the payment.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But what are the biggest misconceptions in 2022? Of economics in general to the layman?
Yeah, so I'll give you some practical misconceptions. One is that corporations make tons of profit. And so this is where, when politicians say,
also,
well, we'll tax the
book,
corporations.
I learned it was that low. I
know, it's astounding.
Was shocked. Walmart, you used the Walmart example.
Walmart's 2%. Yeah.
2%.
Yeah. Now I'll warn listeners who are going to run to Google and check this. If you Google Walmart's profit margin, you will find 2 answers. One is around 20%, and the other is the 2% I just quoted. And people come back to me and say, no, you're wrong about this. Look, it's 20%. Here's the number. There are 2 numbers. There's gross profit margin and net profit margin. Gross profit margin does not include the cost of the infrastructure, the building, the electricity, whatever it is. So if Walmart sold its products on the side of the road, 20% would be the right number. But given that it sells it in stores with parking lots and all of this,
salaries go into the infrastructure cost too. Right?
Indirect salaries do.
Okay.
Yeah, direct salaries, people who are stocking the shelves and working the cash registers, that's part of cost of goods sold.
Okay, right. Okay,
yeah. But the correct number when all the dust settles is 2%, and the average
that's
number,
astounding.
It is astounding. And your grocery store is 1%, right?
Wow.
And I think people get this number wrong because when we go to buy something, you go to the store, and what do you see? You see people in the checkout line handing out all this money for the stuff they're buying. Or you get in an airplane and you do the math in your head. I spent $200 for this ticket and I can multiply by the number of people here. And look at all the money the airline's bringing in.
It's too simplistic.
Yeah, well, it's very easy to see the money that the company brings in.
Yeah, it's visible.
Yeah, it's visible. What you don't see is what it costs. You don't see the money going out. And so we have this outsized impression of how much profit companies make. Yeah, but the right number, the average number for the United States, average corporation is 6% profit.
That's astounding. Yeah, and that's... Is it really as elemental as, just human greed or envy that really is at the core of why we have these... often these begrudging viewpoints toward the wealthy or toward the successful business or...
Yeah, I used to say it was envy. And this is, I talked about the corporate taxes. The other thing that one other misconception is how much money that, the rich have and how much taxes they pay. And but I think I used to say it was envy that, we look at the rich and see how much money they have and say this is a problem. And I've changed my opinion over the past year or so.
Okay.
That I think a better characterization is not envy, but a lack of gratitude, that we aren't thankful for what we have. We take it for granted. Mm-hmm. And, so here we are this is a really nice place you have here.
Thank you.
That it's warm. There's heat here. Yes. And if it gets cold, Eric's going to walk to the wall and turn a knob and it will get warmer.
Very.
And if it's too dark, he's going to plug in a light and we'll get more light. And we take that stuff for granted. It's just part of the atmosphere. Well, of course, this is the way it works. Prior to 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that's not the way it ever worked.
Which isn't that long ago.
Right, it's not that long. In fact, there are places on Earth now where it doesn't work that way. There are school kids, beautiful story of entrepreneurship, school kids in Central Africa who they're trying to study at night, and there's actually a health problem with their studying. You say, well, how can it be a health problem with studying? Because they have these lamps that they would light so that they could read, but the lamps put off, carbon monoxide or whatever it is, and this is bad for them. But there's no electricity. And so some entrepreneur has come up with, he calls it the gravity light. And it's an LED light that has a rope on it that you pull the rope, it generates electricity. But you tie a bag of rocks to this thing. And the rocks, it takes 20 minutes to fall, and it's all geared. So although the thing's falling slowly, it's spinning a gear that generates light, and you get light. And the idea is these kids can now study at night.
Right.
In a more safe environment.
Right.
And
which is life-changing for them.
It's life-changing. And we take that for granted. And to the extent we take it for granted, we'll have a tendency to look at someone like Elon Musk with however many tens of billions of dollars he has and say, that's not fair. Come on, man. You want to talk about not fair? Turn the other direction and look at people who have less.
Why don't we do that?
I think we don't do it because we're surrounded by people who are like us. 98% of American households have air conditioning. 99% have cell phones. Yeah, and so we don't know what poverty is. We are in a lot of ways. We talk about the 1%. If you look globally at the world, the United States itself is pretty much a nation of almost entirely 1%ers.
Yeah, there's no question. Life is, I won't say too easy, that's too subjective, but life is easy now for Americans to exist. I mean, it's easy to exist in this pandemic era. The government's made it easier for people just to exist, which is a whole other discussion. But I mean, I think a lot of that's gone on.
Yeah, but that's a good point that you bring up. Here we are, a nation of, what are we, 300 million odd people.
360 now, I think.
Yeah, and we went through this period where a lot of businesses are shut down. And, yes, there were people who were on the street, but they were the rare exceptions. Generally speaking, life went on. Mm-hmm. We're in a place where we are so wealthy, those of us who are working and earning a paycheck can support people who aren't. Millions, tens of millions of people who aren't, in a standard of living that rivals what royalty had 100 years ago.
I know, and it just takes someone like yourself to articulate that someone can listen to that and maybe kind of somewhat be humble enough to get that. I think it comes back to, I know I beat the drum of humility, Antony, but we just don't have a lot of it in this country as a populace now. It doesn't appear that we do. And I don't think we see things on the news and strife in other countries. And I remember being a kid, and it was, you would see like the Iran-Contra war, and they would show you actual like street combat and things like that were, I guess, really archaic compared to what they could show today if they wanted to for the right manipulative purposes. But that stuff was horrifying to me. And I think now everything that doesn't happen right, if it doesn't happen right in front of your little sphere, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and even worse than that, if you see it on the internet, all of a sudden you think, well, the whole world is like this, when in fact what you're seeing on the internet are the very rare cases.
Agreed. It kind of works both ways in a way. Yeah, I don't know. Back to the action and consequences again, and you talked a lot about trying to find a balance between government and society, because both, pure society leads to a communism, socialism kind of thing, and obviously, is that right? Which one is the
individual and government?
I'm sorry, individual. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between them and trying to find that, because we can bring in regulation and government regulation into business and all of that. We're constantly in that struggle, aren't we? Trying to find, how much are the unwashed masses going to be able to fend for themselves and create on their own, and how much government quote-unquote control is necessary to keep us from killing each other.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And this goes to this, human beings have this dual nature. We're social animals. That is, we're simultaneously individuals, and we're simultaneously and members of a shared society. Social animals. And any time we go too far in either direction, bad things happen. So if you go too far in the social side, you end up in atmosphere like socialism, where we have a government that's controlling everything that everybody does. But you go too far in the individualistic side, and you end up with a bunch of separate people who are living lonely individual existences who
I think of Ayn Rand.
No connection. Yeah.
That dystopian kind of philosophy.
And both sides are dystopian. That's the thing. And so the key to a healthy society is getting that balance right. And if you want a good example that hits home, think about the household, because a household's exactly like this. It's easier if you have kids, you can think about it. You've got a collection of people who are individuals, but they're also members of a shared household. And what happens, the strife we have with teenagers in a household is exactly this. It's the teenager trying to get that balance of, on the one hand, I'm an individual, you can't tell me what to do, I want to do this. But on the other hand, I'm a member of this family and I have obligations, I have responsibilities to the household. And you got to get that right. You go too far in one direction of let the kid be an individual, and you've got a kid who's not being raised, is basically feral. You go too far in the other direction, you have the devouring parent, that I'm going to control everything you do.
The helicopter parent.
Exactly, yeah. And neither extreme is the right answer. The right answer is this balance. And I don't know how to get the right balance. All I can tell you is that it exists, and if you go too far in either direction, you have bad outcomes.
So where's the disconnect in the following? What you just described about parenting, I think, let's just say 96% of parents really get it right. They got to find that balance, right? Which requires balancing, too permissiveness or too strict, right? In its simplistic form. So we do it all the time. And we do it in business. You make business decisions, you give a little, take a little. But when we talk about our dealing with each other in a personal way, or trying to look at things happening in society, we're so polarized. We're buying into extremes all the time. There's that moderation is missing. We're doing it every day. We're maneuvering through life, generally probably pretty well, but we don't. There's those moments of when we look at political thought or associations, and we go right to the extremes and it screws things up. Yeah. Why is that?
Yeah, I think we go to the extremes because we don't make principled decisions. And by that I mean, when we come to decisions as a political body, we don't start by asking what is true. What do we agree on? What are the ground rules? Instead, we start with what do I want?
Oh.
And if you do that, that's a recipe for disaster.
Is that a newer phenomenon?
I don't know if it's newer. It certainly seems that way, that over the past couple of decades we've stopped asking what is true and we've started to ask, what do you want? And maybe this goes back to this movement that was, you can blame academia for it, that's where you saw it first, people saying truth is relative.
Yeah,
there is no truth.
I didn't get that.
Yeah, well, if there is no truth, then you can't talk about principles. And so all you're left with doing is saying, I want this, and you say you want something else.
Life becomes opinions.
Life becomes opinions, right, yeah.
And I think we struggle with that now. We give too much validity, or we demand validity for our opinion in society, I think. And that's a newer thing.
Yeah, I have a right to my opinion. Of course you have a right to your opinion, but you have a right to your opinion. You don't have a right to impose it on me, nor does your right to your opinion mean that your opinion is correct. It may be antithetical to what's true. Now, you can maintain it, that's fine, but you got to live with the consequences of that.
Yes, and would you not agree that in 2022, consequences have been, oftentimes for bad decisions, have been mitigated by our government?
Oh, yeah.
For a lot of society.
Yeah, we've gotten to a place where people it seems to be the case that we believe that people shouldn't be responsible for the consequences of their decisions. And so you get this complete nonsense, and I have a visceral reaction to it because I'm in the industry of student loan forgiveness. And I think this is a horrible, horrible thing. You've got a student who agreed to take a loan for an education, and now all of a sudden says, well, I don't want to have to pay this money back. Well, hang on, you agreed to borrow this money, you agreed to pay it back with certain interest and all of this stuff. And the argument that you'll get is, well, the student can't afford to pay back the loan. Well, if you can't afford to pay back the loan, why did you take it in the first place? You say, well, I need a college education. Well, clearly you don't, because it's not doing anything for you, because it doesn't enable you to pay back the loan, right?
That's too logical, Anthony. That's too logical.
And I think, I suspect, and I'm going to tread very lightly here.
Okay.
So on the one hand, take what I say with a grain of salt. On the other hand, also understand that I'm a professor. I think we're going to reach a point where we start to see class action suits against universities for fraud. That they've said, they told me as a student that I come in here and I would get a degree.
Oh, that's coming.
And I'll be able to do these things, and I can't.
It's an implied guarantee.
Yeah. Well, it gets worse than this, because I've actually talked to some lawyer friends about this. I said, how is this not a thing already? And they said, well, there's no contractual obligation on the part of the university that the student would get a job when he graduates. Okay, I can follow that. But one of the weird things that's happened is over the past 20 years, universities have started requiring that faculty in their syllabi use specific language that says, and they'll tell you exactly what the words should be. By the end of the course, the student will be able to, and then list the things that the student will be able to do by the end of the course. Well, all of a sudden, you've got here in black and white a whole bunch of things. The university has said that by the end of the course, I'll be able to do this, and you went ahead and graduated me, and now I can't get a job because the employer says I can't do these things. How is this not a breach of contract? How is this not fraud?
It's almost, there's an element of sales involved in that.
Yeah.
You do this, you pay this, you'll get this.
Yeah. And so part of the resistance here is that universities, academics in universities, they refuse to admit the fact that they exist in a market environment. They want to believe that they're dispensing knowledge for knowledge's sake. And that's That's fine. If you've got an independently wealthy kid who can come in here and just, I can learn for the sake of learning, that's wonderful. In fact, I'd love it if I had all students who were just learning for the sake of learning. But the fact of the matter is 90+% of them are there so that they can learn something that will enable them to earn money so they can get a job. And the universities aren't acknowledging that. They'll acknowledge it on the periphery and say things like we have good placement. But if you look at the faculty and what it is that they're teaching, their focus isn't, I'm painting broadly here, there are exceptions clearly, but there's too many faculty whose focus isn't there of how can I add value to you as an employee, as opposed to as just learning things.
Okay, I agree with you, but I also think that's to put it entirely on academia is ignoring the root cause of the problem, and that is that going into college should be an informed decision.
Yes.
And it starts with parents, family, and ultimately the person going to the school. In regards to the personal responsibility, is this 4, 6, 8 years of 2 years of my life going to be economically sound based upon what I assume will be opportunities? If you just blame it on academia, you're not putting any personal responsibility on the student, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% there. And I think we've spent the past several decades telling students that the key to success is a college education. And we push them. The high schools push them. The parents push them.
That's a mistake.
The colleges pull them. Right, yeah. And that's a mistake. A college education is not the key to success. It's the key to success in some cases. But we've been selling them a bill of goods. And I think we've gotten away with this. I'll go back to academia. Academia's gotten away with selling this thing because it's been subsidized by the government.
The loan program.
The loan program. The government guarantees these loans. And the simple thought experiment I give you is this. Suppose tomorrow we could change the rules of the game so that colleges would have to loan to students directly out of their endowments. So if a student comes along, he wants to come to this college, he needs a loan, the college itself will make the loan out of the endowment. And you can run the numbers, and actually it works for most colleges. They've got enough endowments so they could do this.
Okay.
You would see on a dime, those colleges would turn. And all of a sudden they would be laser focused on producing students who have market value at the end. Because why? If the students don't have market value, the college doesn't get its money back.
That's free enterprise.
Yeah, that's living with the consequences of your decision. Right. And what's been going on is colleges haven't had to live with the consequences of their decision because somebody else is picking up the bill. If you come through, you spend 4 years and you can't get a job, well, I don't care. You've paid me 4 years of tuition.
Is a lot of the public views snobbery as the way higher education is, and that has to really grind you when you hear that. You probably understand why there's a vision of that out there, but you know the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
How does that get fixed? How does academia do they care? How does that perception change in public with academia? Or can it?
I don't know. I think there's some blame on both sides here, and I encounter this because someone, I'll meet somebody and when they find out I'm a college professor, instantly I'm put in a box, right?
Okay.
Oh, this guy knows all this stuff, and he's all of this. The assumption of snobbery is there.
Okay.
And that, of course, puts me on the defensive, right?
Sure.
So I think that's on the one side. On the other side, I'll get. Of course, I'm going to paint with broad brush here. There are exceptions, but there are too many faculty who aren't intellectually humble.
Okay.
When they're talking to other faculty, they'll tend to be so. So if you're an economist and I'm an economist and you say something that I've never heard before, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and I'll think this through. But I'll say we, not enough of us will extend the same courtesy to someone who isn't an expert. So someone who comes along to me and says,
I think scientists do the same thing.
Yeah, maybe so. And it's understandable in some sense, because I'll have people who come to me and say, I know what's wrong with the economy. It's the following. They're completely wrong about the whole thing, right? But once in a while, I'll get someone who come to me and say, well, but have you thought about the following things? And the person may be wrong in saying that, but it opens the door to a conversation.
Absolutely.
And many times, when someone has come to me and said, have you thought about the following things? And they're wrong. And I'll sit down and explain to them why they're wrong about this. But a lot of these times, I'll get a nugget of something I hadn't thought of before.
And that is intrinsically beautiful.
It's beautiful because we both, and this is the way I describe it to people, that a good, healthy conversation like that is not a debate of me versus you. It's a cooperation of us versus ignorance.
Oh, man, that might be the best statement ever made on this show. That is fantastic.
Each of us brings something to the table.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that. And we referenced a little bit before the show, the spirit of this entire thing was just to get people to have conversations and to come in with a level of humility and learn from each other and have fun. Mm-hmm. And I think that's lost a lot now. I mean, do you still find the engagement with your students as rewarding today as you did years prior?
No, much less so today. And I'm not sure why. I know the symptom. I don't know the cause.
Okay.
The symptom is the students don't ask questions. I know they have questions. They won't ask. They won't engage. They become stenographers. Whatever I say, they just write it down and go about their business.
Any thoughts on why that is?
Well, that's the thing. I'm not sure what the cause is. I don't know.
The pandemic didn't help.
No, the pandemic didn't help at all, but it was this way before. I know that they grapple with this stuff because and I know this, it was my experience when I was in school. I know I've had students report this to me. My own kids who are now college age will tell me, they'll get together with their buddies in a dorm room, you get a 6 of beer and you start talking about the life, universe, and everything. And that kind of conversation, that should be going on in the classroom. I mean, it's fine, it goes on the door, but it should go in the classroom as well. But it's not going on in the classroom. And now that we're having this conversation, I think I might have a handle on what the cause is. That the students see me in 2 roles. One is the role of professor, that I'm going to impart information to them. And the other is the role of evaluator, that I'm going to evaluate them. Mm-hmm. And it's that second role that scares them. They don't want to ask questions because and I've had students say these exact words, I didn't want to ask questions because I didn't want to appear stupid.
Is that a function of today's social media society?
I don't know. Maybe. But I can tell you this, we did an experiment at Duquesne, and unfortunately we stopped doing it, but I thought it was working beautifully. And the experiment we tried for a few years was that we would have whatever it is, 5 or 6 of us would be teaching principles level economics. And when it came time for the final exam, we would get somebody to write the final exam who was not any of the people who were teaching the courses.
Okay.
Now, it would be an economist who knew what the final exam should look like. And the students knew this, that their professors, were not writing the final exam. And it changed that dynamic dramatically because the students started to view us as resources, as collaborators.
Not the evaluator.
Not the evaluator. We're going to help them get through. In fact, if anything, we have the same incentive they do because the better they score on the test, the better we look as their faculty.
On the same team.
We're all on the same team. Yeah. And that, for the few years that we did that, it really changed the tenor of the classroom. I don't know. Some bureaucratic something was going on.
But sounds like a fascinating idea.
It was. And, the more I talk about it, I'm just coming to this realization. I'm sitting here talking to you. I'm going to go back and say we should go back to doing this again.
Yeah, because, it just on the premise, it changes the teacher-student dynamic there.
Yeah.
and it made it palatable for the student, and maybe have taken away some of their reservations and how engaged they got.
Yeah. Yeah. Now imagine if we did that sort of thing. You can't do one exam at the end of 4 years, but imagine if we did like a serious exam at the end of each of the 4 years, and that was kind of it. That was your exam. It would change. Our universities would become scholarly centers once again, instead of 5-star hotels.
Could that concept translate to high school as well, and grade school and junior high?
Probably. It's harder there because universities are more able to do whatever they want. We're not bound by whatever the rules are that the educational
forget
systems.
the rules for a second. I mean, just the concept. I mean, are we creating that adversarial evaluator, subject evaluator mindset very young?
Maybe. I know when I did graduate work in New York State. When I was in New York State, they no longer have it there. But at the time, they had some statewide exam that the high school students had to take. And apparently it was a serious thing. Yes, you could graduate high school without it, but if you didn't do it, you were, considered a quasi-failure type thing. Regents exam, they called it, the Regents exam. And it was that. Everybody had to take this thing.
That seems to be almost too logical. That just makes too much darn sense. Do you have, when you sit and ponder just about or let's just say you're driving and you're whatever you're listening to, hopefully something to let your mind cool down, because I think you think a lot. You're the kind of guy that definitely thinks a lot. When you hear nonsense on the news, when you're kind of inundated with garbage, do you still have hope for society? Do you have hope for where we're going? Do you think that can we right the ship?
Yeah. Because here's why. When you listen to the news, and even when you look at politics, you think about Democrats or Republicans, the left and the right, all of that, you're seeing the extremes. Mm-hmm. Both the Democrats and the Republicans, both of them are minorities now. The plurality of voters are none of the above. They're independents. Mm-hmm. And so when we see the left on the news or the right on the news, what you're not seeing is the huge bulk of people in the center. What you're seeing is the far left and the far right. And
it's pretty scary.
Yeah, and you walk away thinking that we're a country comprised of half of us are gun-toting pickup truck that don't care about anybody, and the other half of us are tree-hugging wackos who want to take control of everything. Yes, there are people like that, but very few. The bulk of us are reasonable people I want to say in the center, but reasonable people who agree with some things on the left and some things on the right. And I think if you keep that in mind, you have great hope. I have great hope. And the way to see it is to take your eyes away from the news and look at your neighbors and see what they're doing.
No question.
And you'll see reasonable people doing reasonable things, helping out each other, behaving, generally speaking, quite well. Mm-hmm.
So no, wearing the political identity on your shirt sleeve is something relatively new to me. I grew up in this town we're in right now, heavily Democratic town, and I probably was raised by the only Republican in the town. So I had a Democratic mother and family, and a father transplanted who was a Republican. So I got it all, man. But it was great because it really made me think at a young age. The point I'm saying is, a couple weeks before in a local election or something, you might get someone to come to the house, or you might see someone with a button, or, I remember the Carter buttons and the Reagan buttons. The thing was, outside of those times, Anthony, politics didn't rule your identity. I mean, people weren't associating with the person down the street because that's a Republican. I know he's a Trumper or he's a Biden fan. Nobody cared, and no one wanted to be identified as who they belong to. That's all different now.
It is, and I think it's a result of government overreach. The bigger government becomes and the more it intrudes into our lives, the more important it becomes. whether you're a Democrat or Republican, because how you vote is going to affect me in ways I might not like. And the reason it's affecting me is because the government has become so intrusive.
I get it. And I definitely believe the middle always kind of runs the show anyways, right? I mean, because that's where most people are at, somewhere in that wide vat middle. But I think if you look to your neighbor and you see the goodness in society, you can do all of that. But we are a little more caustic now. And I just don't know why. And we had this relatively. I asked Antony when he was here. I said, I was in an industry where I realized from a marketing standpoint that individuality and the spirit of collecting things and the look at me moment that Americans seem to love, it benefited me really well in the prior business I was in. And I think that we're still that way, especially with social media and the younger demographic, the look at me, the show me this, look at me, Instagram world we're in. Yet we're so quick to join teams and political affiliations and clubs and so forth. And it's a weird dichotomy. And you were able to articulate to me what your thoughts are on that. So if you don't mind me sharing that.
Yeah, I think we've reached a point where we identify with the team because we haven't thought through carefully the implications of what's being said. Talk about free tuition or free health care or stopping immigration or whatever it is. If you don't think through these things carefully, your tendency is to pick a side and say, well, I think tuition would be a great idea. I think keeping out the immigrants would be a great idea, or letting them in would be a great idea, or whatever it is. And I'll latch on to the politician who says those things. And whatever flavor he is, Democrat or Republican, I'll put everybody in a box.
Because it's easy?
Because it's easy. Everybody who says, well, I'm a Democrat, well, you must agree with everything this person said. And now you're in the good box.
You can't live that way.
And no, you can't. I think it's dehumanizing, because what happens is I encounter you on the street and I don't even have to ask anymore. I don't have to ask what your party affiliation is. I can just listen to you talk about stuff and I can figure out, okay, he's probably a D or he's probably an R. And I put you in that box and I assume all sorts of things about you. And so I've got you figured out. I know all these things that Eric will like or not like. And if there are things that I like, Eric's a good guy. If there are things I don't like, well, he's evil. Because clearly the things I like are good and right and just. And he doesn't. And so the only reason must be because he's evil. And what I've done, I've dehumanized you because I haven't connected with Eric.
Yeah.
What I've done is built an image of what I think Eric is.
No question.
And that's what I relate with.
Yeah, and that quick to label is just so non-productive. It's messing up the mechanics of life.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a quick shorthand, but why? Engage with each other. Give each other the benefit of the doubt. I have this problem all the time. I write tons of op-eds, and someone will read the headline and do the same thing, put my op-ed in a box and write me back and say, well, you're an idiot because you believe the following things. I say, how do you know I believe the following things? And what's happened is the person has assumed all sorts of things about me from reading this headline, rather than forget about getting to know me. He hasn't even read the article itself. It's dehumanizing.
It is. And obviously, any discussion of free markets, any discussion, before you even get to the nuts and bolts of the conversation, you mention it, you're immediately labeled as a conservative.
Right.
I mean, there's no way to even get so you're going to lose a lot of people right away because they already have that bias, and now your job is even harder.
Yeah, it is, and it's so sad. I feel actually for people on the left, because when they hear me saying free market stuff, they put me in the conservative box, and they miss out on tons of things that I agree with the left on, and that I'd be right out there in the forefront saying, look, here's things that are important to the left that are right, and we should do these things.
100%.
And they miss on that. And so I'm pushed against my will. I'm pushed into the right because those are the only people who will engage with me. The people on the left refuse to talk to me.
So you have hope for humanity. Take that circumstance. How do we correct that? Like how will it naturally just correct itself in society?
I think one thing I have found is that if I hold back and don't tell people things, instead ask them questions. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And develop enough of a rapport, and it doesn't take long to do it, develop enough of a rapport that they see me as a person, and I'll use the word trust me. Then they'll listen to other things I have to say. So when I talk about things like the federal government should have a much smaller footprint in the economy, I don't talk about federalism, which is, of course, associated with the right of the federal government should be small and the state should do lots of things. Instead, I talk about subsidiarity, which is something that the people on the left love.
Of course.
They're the same thing.
Exactly. Semantics.
Yeah. And it's not, semantics is right, but it's not advertising in the sense of I'm
understood.
Presenting something isn't true. Rather, it's showing the person all the things we agree on
Absolutely right.
rather than showing them the things we disagree on first.
It's just a conversational skill, and we're not doing enough of that in society.
Yeah.
And is that even? I don't even know if we're even trained as grade schoolers and junior high schoolers to really even effectively communicate with each other.
No, because we're taught to express our opinions. One of the most useful techniques that I've developed in talking with people is first to keep my mouth shut, listen to what they're saying. And if there's a point of disagreement, rather than saying, okay, you're wrong and here's why, instead I say, okay, here's what I heard you say. And I'll repeat in my own words what the person said. And half of the time, the person says, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this.
That's powerful.
And if once I get straight what it is they're actually saying, a lot of times we're actually not in disagreement.
Misinterpretation's a big issue, whether it's coming from the misinterpretations coming from those receiving or those giving. It does happen.
And it's not just the misinterpretation. It's that if I have heard you correctly and I disagree, you're more apt to listen to my disagreement because you know that I heard what you were saying.
That's general conversational skill sets. I mean, we just don't. It's are we at a grade school level, as an elementary school level and junior high, are we preparing these children in a way that will foster human interaction, or are we really going down a virtual road right now that is a little dicey?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on at the K through 12. I don't know what's happening there. I don't think the virtual is the problem.
Okay.
And I give you an example. I'll give you two examples, one on each side. First, Twitter. Twitter is lousy for this sort of thing. In 240 characters.
It's the garbage dump of the internet.
Yeah. In 240 characters, all I can do is give. I can say things to you. I can't hear you back.
Right.
But we have. It accompanies our podcast, Words and Numbers. On Facebook, we have a group, Words and Numbers Backstage.
Fantastic, by the way.
Oh, are you in there? Excellent. Words and Numbers Backstage. Listeners will join there, and there is a ton, and by a ton I mean probably a post every 5 minutes from somebody of discussion there of politics, of economics, of social issues, people disagreeing on the internet, and the conversation is supremely civil.
Yeah, it's civility at its best.
It is, and I think it comes...
How'd you do that?
Yeah, beats me. I have no idea.
How did you instrument that?
But it kind of evolved. It evolved spontaneously. But what has evolved is this atmosphere in which everybody there understands that when they say something that other people might disagree with, the other people will give them a hearing. and that if they disagree, they'll attack the points
Right.
and the reasoning, not the person.
The person.
And so what happens? It happens from time to time. It happened the other day. We'll have somebody new join. We have people joining all the time. Somebody new join who is used to the internet, and they'll come in and say, "You people are idiots," and I have to pull them aside and say, "No, that's not how we roll here."
Yeah, I totally understand, and I guess that's it's gotten real personal and caustic. Like we're quick to, and I know that as human beings, I really believe there's so much more goodness in every single human than there is bad.
Yeah,
we just somehow last 5 years we've kind of flipped it a little bit, and we lead with a caustic nature.
We do, and I'll tell you from experience,
Or an adversarial nature. I don't know.
We do, and what contributes to that is if you come at me with an adversarial tone, my tendency is to come back in an adversarial tone, just escalates. But I've seen this. I've been a party to this being diffused so quickly and so easily. So I'll get tons of email from people who see our stuff or read our stuff or whatever it is, and people will say, "You're an idiot," and they list out the thing. And so my technique is to take a deep breath, read through what they've said, and pick out a few points, because there's always a few points that they say they're reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Pull them out and respond to that as if the person had presented it with great manners. So don't respond to the vitriol, any of that. And my God, Eric, 99% of the time, I'm not kidding you, 99% of the time the person will write back, and it's
no doubt,
and it's a completely different person. We're having a good conversation, and of those who write back, a goodly number of them will say outright, "I'm sorry, I was rude."
But I will tell you, and I come back to that word humility, had you not led with humility, even though you're strong in your conviction and you know the person could even be wrong, if you can't be humble enough to start and that's a very wise way to handle conversation. That's conversational skill, but not live conversational skill. Even and to do it written's even more difficult, I think, effectively.
Right.
But that it comes back to humility, and I think that we all have it in us. A lot of us just don't exercise it.
I guess there's two things. We all have it in us, and our tendency is to react emotionally. You kind of have to swallow your pride a little bit to do this.
Yeah.
But the thing I find fascinating about the story is not what I bring to the table, but what the other person brings to the table. That this vitriol that came in was so thin. All it took was one polite email, and it goes away.
That's fantastic.
And that goes to what you're saying. People at their not even at their core, it's just a millimeter below the level. They're really good. You just have to give them a chance.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing is recognizing that this is what we have to work with. A lot of folks are running around, and their first inclination is to be caustic.
Yeah.
But it's really superficial.
Yeah.
It's not really it's an essence of who they are as a person.
Yeah.
So by us making the mistake of just labeling them, that they're just an idiot. Well, you just played into this tit for tat that just ruined the entire experience. You're never going to know.
Yep. You're never going to know. And, you send that person away doing two things. One, they're justified that their approach was the right approach.
Yeah.
And next time they encounter someone like me, they're going to do the same thing.
Yeah, you would hope that it spreads. They learn from the experience too.
Yeah.
And they give the same courtesy that you gave them to start. If someone came to you and said, I hear you and I understand that, Fox is going to give me this right-wing slant and CNN's going to give me this left-wing slant and CNBC is, I don't know what they do, and where do I get my news? If I'm looking for just the raw facts, where would you acknowledge or suggest that someone look?
Yeah, I don't know where you can get just raw facts anymore. My technique is to pick two reputable sources on both sides, on each side. So Wall Street Journal is my go-to for the more conservative side, and NPR for the more liberal side, and read both of them with an open mind.
Yeah, and again, that gets back to human laziness because now you're asking someone to do double duty work.
You do double duty, right? Yeah.
But you almost have to do that. Like I for many years, I don't think I was ever a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, but I voted conservative for a long time. And naturally, when the Drudge Report came out, when the Clinton affair happened in the 90s, I was sucked in for the sensationalism. So Drudge was a website that I'd go to, and I'd go to CNN, I'd go to Fox, and I would laugh at how they would be in complete opposite of each other. But the Drudge Report was at one time, I think, a conservative-leaning thing, and then he sold it, and it became a liberal-leaning thing. But the laughable part for me now is sad, is that even yesterday I went there after not going there for a while, and every headline was written in a way where it wasn't even news-based. It was almost like they were writing slogans like for a promotion of a movie coming out. Like, what can be the most bombastic, sensationalist, like one sentence that will get you to go to that movie?
Right.
Every single line's that way.
Because they want you to click, or they want you to keep scrolling so the ads appear so they make revenue. That's what's going on.
But it's everything is so, I hate to use that word caustic. It's so... It's like bait. It's just like titillating bait.
It is
human bait.
It is, and I've noticed as well the writing style. Articles now, you don't get to the meat of what's going on until about the third paragraph. And the first two paragraphs are honestly, you could just delete them, right?
100%.
But what's going on is you got to scroll it, and a couple more ads will appear as you scroll before you get to that third paragraph.
What about this, where I'm noticing, I don't know, you could say, this was going to happen, and so-and-so said this, and you'd go and you'd read in the first paragraph or two that an insinuation that they said this, or they might have said this, and then they nullify it,
right?
Or they add more context 2 or 3 paragraphs down. They kind of makes it a non-issue. Like, why would you even put a headline? Because it really isn't anything.
Well, I'll give you a good example.
But that's all the time.
Yeah, I'll give you a good example of that happened with me. I had a tweet that went viral saying that if you confiscate 100% of the wealth of all the billionaires in the United States, you'd fund the government for 8 months.
I saw it.
And it ended up getting fact-checked by PolitiFact. And they gave it originally when it came out, they gave it a false.
Okay.
But if you read the thing, and the person, I actually spoke with the writer who wrote the article. If you read the thing, they say, yeah, they did the math, and if you confiscate 100% of the wealth, you can run the government for 9 months. Where I said 8.
That's what I mean.
And
it's like,
yeah.
But it got the reader there.
It got the reader. Yeah.
Which got the ads in front of them.
Yep.
And it's like, and again, I'm a capitalist in regards to I love commerce. I love I love that. But at the same time, there's something disingenuous if you're just putting people's eyeballs on a screen to sell them. There's something manipulative. And when I say that, I've had some right wingers tell me that, you're just against free markets. No, I'm not. I just think that if you have to, there needs to be truth in advertising. You're going to have to put advertising in front of somebody. I want you to get them there in earnest. Mm-hmm. Through honesty, right?
Yeah, and in this, I don't know how to deal with this. One possibility is that it will sort itself out. And I give you as an example, tabloids. When I was a kid, I didn't understand why my parents were hiding all this wonderful news from me. Because I go with them through the grocery store line. There's this fabulous stuff in the newspaper, and they're not.
Michael Jackson and the Alien,
right? Yeah. And you learn that that's nonsense. And I think the internet and the social media is new enough that we haven't learned yet what's nonsense and what isn't. And I think that will evolve.
What's horrifying to me, I don't know if you'll remember this, but when Clinton and Lewinsky scandal broke, it was unfortunately the National Enquirer who had the best
Right.
factual articles on there, which gave them an air, for a short period of time, an air of quote unquote legitimacy, where they were sending like a correspondent to the White House press briefings. It was nuts, man. Like, and that kind of eventually faded itself out. But tabloids, I mean, are they still a thing? I mean, There's still
a thing.
Weekly World News and all that stuff.
Uh-huh.
When you see sites like the Daily Mail, because it really looks professional, it's Britain's. We had institutions in this country that they're still there, I guess. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Washington Times, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune. Mm-hmm. Those are newspaper institutions, generally 80% with a liberal slant, the big ones. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, the Brits are different. Their tabloid and quote unquote real news is so blended together.
Right.
So when you see things like the Daily Mail, do you pay that any fodder? Do you look at that?
I do this. What I'm going to tell you, I do with Daily Mail. I do with all news, even stuff coming from the Wall Street Journal. If I've read something and I'm interested enough that I want to comment on this or forward or something, I'll check it.
Other news services.
Other news services. And this is not something, I'm an academic. You don't need to be an academic to do this. You can Google the thing. You can find data easily enough to corroborate or not corroborate what's going on. And it's happened a couple of times. I've run across stuff that looked seriously legitimate that I was about to forward. I said, well, let me check this out. And it turns out it's not the case, or it's kind of the case, but it's twisted enough that it's really not worth forwarding anymore.
Are there really news articles anymore, or has everything got an editorial opinionated slant to it?
It seems to me everything's got an opinionated slant. Right, and sometimes, we're talking about labeling, using the word conservative, attaching it to think tank versus just plain old think tank. Subtle things like that you'll find all over the place.
I remember a decade or so ago that you would hear liberal think tank, but you never hear that anymore.
No, you don't. Yeah. And you'll hear it with in stories with involving shootings, with the perpetrator, the victim. Sometimes they'll say the black person, sometimes they won't. Mm-hmm. And it's in or it's out to slant the thing in one way or the other.
Terrible. But that's the reality that we're in. So you almost have to be a very astute and eye-opened consumer of news if you're really
you have to be skeptical.
Yeah. Is the truth? The definition of the truth is nothing to do with being subjective. But in today's interpretation of the word truth, what is it now?
Yeah, well, this is, people talk about my truth. Give me a break. It's our truth. If it's yours, it's not truth, it's opinion, or it's experience, but it's not.
Yeah, which I would imagine, being a statistician, being an economist, being a man of science of any capacity, physicist, that whole, you folks to label, right? All you folks looking in at our society, you got to be scratching your head a little bit, because science has been run on the pursuit of truth forever. And it doesn't seem like humans are really that concerned about finding the truth, more about finding those who think like us.
Yeah, it's very much that. And, science is... I would say science is not about finding the truth, it's about pursuing the truth. The difference being that even when we get an answer, we're not going to say this is the truth, but rather, given what we understand, this is what we think is, right? And we're open that someone might come along later and demonstrate that this is not the case. And so this business that people say in the media about the science is settled, science is never settled. That's contradictory to what science is. Science is an ongoing pursuit.
Talk about it as comfortable as you are. I don't want to push you in any direction at all. But the pandemic. Speak a little bit about that and how we have reacted in regards to the hysteria. And I'll use the word. And maybe the lockdowns and so forth. Has the efforts of mitigation versus freedom and whatever that even means anymore, and control. Where are we right now?
I think historians are going to look back on this period as
And laugh?
well as one of two things. They're either going to look back on it as, the period of this great pandemic, or they're going to look back on it as a period of an outbreak of mass psychosis. And I don't know which way it's going to go yet, largely because the data isn't entirely in. But on the one hand, you have this novel virus that was, we didn't know how deadly it was. It appeared to be extremely deadly, and we reacted in a certain way. But as evidence came in that it wasn't as deadly as we thought, not to say it wasn't deadly, but it wasn't as deadly as we thought, we didn't adjust. We kept this DEFCON 4 thing going on. So much so that Omicron comes along, and all of a sudden we're talking about lockdowns again and all of this, when Omicron is much less of a problem than the original COVID. And what all of this yells at me is it's one more instance in which we failed to consider trade-offs. That the politicians see this virus coming, and they can make one of two errors. They can either lock us down when the lockdown isn't necessary, or they can fail to lock us down when the lockdown is necessary. If they err in this failing to lock us down when they should lock us down, that's immediately apparent, because we got body counts, we got people dying, and everybody knows what the problem is. The politicians didn't do what they should have done.
Okay.
But if they err in this other direction of locking us down when it wasn't necessary, it's harder to say. It's harder to see that they made the error, because we can look around and say, well, nobody's dying. Why are we locked down? And the politicians can always say, nobody's dying because we're locked down. And so when you look at the politicians' incentives, they had a strong incentive to err on this side of locking down even if it wasn't necessary. And that in turn causes the rest of us to think, oh my God, this is a serious thing. Not
Heighten
to say
the fear component.
Yeah, not to say it's not a serious thing,
Right.
but it heightens the fear component.
Right,
And of course the media then, they make their money from selling advertising, which they sell by showing us scary things. They get to plaster this all over the place, which what does that do? It reinforces our fear, which even further reinforces the incentive of the politician to hold the lockdown, because, oh my God, my voters are going crazy.
Got it.
And it's got this almost perfect storm of incentives that lead you to this thing. And what's the end result? Well, the end result is, and again, the numbers aren't entirely in yet, but the early estimates are that the lockdown will be costing us somewhere around $16 trillion over the course of the next decade. Now, you can say, well, yeah, but we saved some lives. Well, how many lives did we save? If you look at the numbers, it seems to be somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 1 million, maybe a couple 100,000, maybe 300,000. It's not clear, but that's the magnitude of numbers you're talking about for that kind of for the lockdown. Now, everybody take a deep breath here, because we spent $16 trillion saving, let's be generous, 500,000 lives. We lose more lives than that to cardiovascular disease every single year. And we're not close to spending $16 trillion fighting that. Now, there are all kinds of arguments people can make. Well, cardiovascular disease is different. It's not a disease. It's not a contagious disease. It's a contagious disease. And that's fine. I understand there are differences. My point is that it seems that our reaction to COVID was way outsized compared to our reaction to other things that are far more deadly.
Cancer or
right. Yeah.
Cardiovascular disease.
And that tells me that there's some disconnect. I won't know what the disconnect is until the numbers come in, and that we're talking a couple of years from now.
Do you believe in all the numbers? I mean, I don't mean conspiratorial, but I mean, do you think there's integrity? Are you confident that there's integrity with the numbers?
I'm confident there's integrity in the numbers. I'm not so confident in how the numbers are reported. So
help me understand.
For example, the media at the outset reported COVID deaths. So back in early 2020, every night in the news, so many people died of COVID. So many people died of COVID. Well, as the deaths from COVID started to drop, and the media doesn't have any bad news to report, so they switch, and they switch to infections. So number of infections, and those are going up.
Okay.
Now, both of those numbers are correct, but the way they were presented, as if you talk about the COVID numbers. What do you mean the COVID number? You talk about the infections or the
Right.
the deaths? And
Right.
and even then with the infections, are you talking about people who were hospitalized or people who, had the symptoms of a mild cold and went back to work
Right.
later?
Right.
And so I think there is much bait and switch when it came to how the numbers were presented. But the numbers themselves coming from the CDC, I think, they're not perfect by any means.
Right.
But generally, I think they're okay.
And I have to believe in them because I have to have a baseline right. I don't want to walk around not trusting anybody because there are people that do. They don't trust anything and everything is a conspiracy.
Yeah, but then everything's off the table at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I guess my thing is I don't know if there is a logical conclusion in sight of COVID. And of course, a lot of factors. Well, will there be more variants? Well, it was likely to me, the layman, there's probably always going to be variants for a period of time at least. It's just how do we react to them?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I would have been much more. I'm leaning against the lockdowns. I would have been much more accepting of them if the politicians had been a little bit more honest at the outset. If they had said something like, okay, we're going to lock down in the following ways, and here's the metric. When we hit this target, we're going to release the lockdown or release it in the following ways. And however they define the metric, number of cases or number of deaths, whatever it is. But they didn't do that. And so it became this open-ended thing that, well, when's it going to end? Well, we were initially told that it was to flatten the curve.
4 weeks, flatten the curve.
Right, 4 weeks, flatten the curve. And then it was, until the deaths peak. Then it was until the cases peak. And then it was, until we get a vaccine. And then it was, until we get herd immunity. And then along comes Delta and we get to wash and rinse and repeat the whole thing all over again, right? And so I blame politicians a lot here in not presenting the lockdown well. I think they would have had broad support if they had said, okay, here's what we're going to do and here's where we're going to release it. Instead, what those of us who are somewhat skeptical of government, what we saw was this massive power grab that they were going to release whenever they felt like it. Mm-hmm. And if you look at our history of government making power grabs, it never releases.
So am I going out on a limb here and say that you're a proponent of state rights?
Yeah, so let me see, this is those words again, because when you say state rights, understandably and rightly so, people go to civil war and slavery.
I didn't look at it that way, but okay.
Well, see, and this is a good thing because this is another discussion technique of when you're talking about things, think about how a person who would disagree with you the most would hear the words you're saying.
It's a shame
right?
you have to do it that way, but you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
And so I go back to subsidiarity, and I would say what can be handled at a local level should not be handled at a state level. Mm-hmm. What can be handled at a state level should not be handled at a federal level. And the reason for that is to minimize the distance between the people who make decisions and the people who live with
100%,
the consequences.
100%.
Smaller distance is, the better decisions you get made.
Okay. The reason I asked that question is this pandemic is the first time in my life that there was real public discourse about the power of the federal government versus states' rights. It was out in the open for us all to see. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just legislation. It was in front of our face every day. Right. The president or senators, House representatives are on the federal level saying things, and then governors having a lot of power in their individual states and being able to do certain things, and then they're all rubbing against each other. And the confusion was, I think the public really didn't know who to listen to. and it always didn't fall along political lines either. I think as the election got closer, it kind of did, but in the beginning, when they were locking down, this is what gave me hope for society. An opportunity for two political sides to become more caustic. It didn't happen that way. It happened that entrepreneurs and the self-employed were over here, and all the salaried folks were kind of over here, because the salaried folks generally got money to keep their lifestyle going. Mm-hmm. The self-employed were not. So you had that divide, which crossed all political lines, right? So,
yeah.
But at least that showed me that, hey, we're not probably so dyed in the wool for our political side that here's another division. But I guess what the point I'm trying to make is, we just did not know who to listen to, and then we got COVID celebrities, whether they're politicians, Fauci, other senators who had a loud mouth. Nobody knows who's telling them the quote unquote truth, and that, I think, is the public's confusion and fear. It comes from that, I believe.
Yeah.
So we got federalism versus state rights out in front of us, and who the hell do we listen to?
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you. This goes back to the humility. I think Fauci would have come across much better if he said, "I don't know." Let's see what happens. And the fact is, the original data that was coming in was biased, simply because of how it was collected. We had there weren't many COVID tests, and so they were only used on people who were sick enough to come into the hospital. Well, if you're sick enough to come into the hospital, the likelihood of you being sick enough to die is much higher. And so we thought initially that the fatality rate on COVID was like 5 or 10 times what it actually ended up being. I think President Trump got some bad press for doing something, I think, that was right. I don't know I can't say whether he did deliberately, but I think it was the right thing to do. And that is, he got the bad press because he was being accused of not doing anything. Of this, the whole COVID thing's going on. We're not getting a federal response. And people said, we need a federal response. No, we actually don't. We don't want a federal response, because this goes back to this idea of subsidiarity. The COVID hit New York City very, very differently than it hit Pittsburgh.
Absolutely.
And very differently there than it hit Wisconsin. And what the solution that worked for New York City would not have worked for Pittsburgh, and whatever worked for Pittsburgh wouldn't have worked for Wisconsin. And if you ask the federal government to step in and do something, you're going to get a one-size-fits-no-one.
Absolutely.
Instead, we did it right. We did it by subsidiarity.
Yeah, and I think that, and I wasn't really pleased. I'm a realtor, so we were shut down, and we had some weird gymnastics to get through what we did. And I wasn't crazy about Wolf in this state, because I think oftentimes Pittsburgh was treated the same as Philadelphia, and there wasn't, and Harrisburg probably was really screaming because they were, being treated like we were too.
Right.
But in the big picture, handling it state by state was probably the only logical thing to do. But I just don't know, will we ever be in a state of normality again? Is that normalcy? Are we ever going to be there, or are we just going to have to live with this until it's just not the forefront of our discussions and at our lives?
Yeah, I think we will get back to normalcy, and the reason I say that is because it seems that people have had enough. They've realized that, as deadly as it is, it's not at that level that the media was telling us, the politicians were telling us, and the costs are gargantuan. And I give as evidence, it was astounding to me, and this happened, good Lord, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. I was at a major airport, inside, so I'm inside security, where of course, you got to wear the mask and the whole business. And I would say probably 5% of the people that I saw, not eating, people just walking around, didn't have their masks on. I don't mean like pulled down. Airport. I mean mask off.
Wow.
If there's any place in this country you're going to wear a mask when you're told to, it's going to be in an airport. And that told me that we've turned a corner. Reasonable people have said we've had enough.
And that's ultimately what it's going to take, is just the public making a decision that we're just not going to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting just to see, how the folks in rural Idaho compared to the folks in New York City, just the whole, and in Pittsburgh, we get a little flavor of the city life and we're, right next to the Midwest. So I guess if you're on a farm in Idaho and all this is happening, you must think like the world's just insane. Like the things you see on television, this can't be true. This has to be a movie, right? I mean, it's not affecting you the same as if you're living in the Bronx.
Right.
Yes. And I think that's where, and would you say that also speaks to the problem with our news services? I mean, because, crime in LA and in New York, which is on the rise, but it's not happening in the same in Idaho and in Butte, Montana and things, but they're still showing the people in Butte all this stuff that's happening in New York and Los Angeles, right?
Yeah.
As if that's the normal.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and so the rest of us all think that what's going on down the street is what's happening in New York City. I used to live in the middle of West Virginia, middle of nowhere. We had in a village of 50 people. It was the largest collection of human beings for an hour drive in any direction.
Oh my gosh,
it's a great thing, and you'd watch the news and see this stuff, and it was literally like watching a fictional program. That what was going on there, what was presented, even what's presented in Pittsburgh, was so foreign to our way of life that it might as well be fiction.
I believe it. Okay, so I have one last question for you for today. I'm going to make a hard right turn here. Do you ever give any thought to Are We Alone?
You mean the universe?
Yeah, in the universe, the government released things that's got everybody up in an uproar that maybe there's UFOs and there's just all. And of course, in 2020 they're going to do this. Right? We have nothing better to do. Let's just tell the public now that UFOs do exist and we've had material and we've been working on it for all these years. And by the way, it's a pandemic, and just forget we even said that. Like, did you ever get any thought like that? Are we alone?
Yeah, well, I'm a statistician by training, so
that's why I wanted to ask.
It's virtually impossible that we're alone. The probability, you take the number of stars and all of this, and there's a beautiful thing if you're interested in looking at this. It's called the Drake equation. It dates back to like the 1950s. Check out the Drake equation.
He's still alive, too.
Oh, is he still alive?
Yeah, he's
oh my
still
God,
alive.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
So he's just roughly speaking, he starts out by saying there's so many trillion stars in the known universe, and if 50% of them had planets, this, and if 20% of those had planets that were in habitable areas, this, and he keeps going down, knocking thing down, and he says the final end is, if given all of these things, I've sliced the numbers as hard as I can, and I'm still left with several 100,000 civilizations in existence right now.
The Goldilocks zone, I guess. It was so far from their sun that would their star that would provide the right temperature and climate and all that stuff. Yeah, I just wondered. I love people that are deep thinkers and people in academia. I always ask that question because I think I've been really surprised by the answers. Folks,
really?
The folks that I thought, no, there's just no way they're going to believe, like Bob Lazar and Area 51. There's no way. And I've been surprised. People are like, oh, yeah, for sure. And I'm like, whoa, it's a whole new side of them come out. Like, oh, I didn't see that coming. But it's I just think it's fascinating that our government acknowledged it, and that just didn't. They acknowledged it's something they don't understand. They're dealing with, and I thought that did they just slide that in during the pandemic, or was that like is that a real thing? I mean,
my colleague James Harrigan has said, and I could buy his argument. He has said that, in his opinion, the government has known for a long time about the existence of extraterrestrial life, and has been slowly letting the information out until we get to the point that the general populace says, oh yeah, of course there's life, so that when it becomes obvious, there isn't some mass panic. It's everybody say, oh yeah, that's George, the alien. Yeah, we always knew they were there.
And what better time to at least the bulk of that information when we're all diverted
right
for a worldwide pandemic. Did you have fun?
This is great. Thank you so much. It's so nice not to have to be driving the conversation.
I can't thank you enough for doing this, and I would love to have you back.
I'm happy to come back anytime.
And I'd love to have your partner if we can get him to come to Pittsburgh.
We'll get James to come out here. He's a hoot.
Yeah. And how can they all reach you again?
You can find our podcast at Words and Numbers. Where are we? Good Lord. Words and Numbers podcast.
I didn't have any problem finding
Let
you.
me think. Wordsandnumbers.org. Wordsandnumbers.org and on all the podcast players.
Go to Spotify. You can't miss them.
Yeah.
Okay, and talk about the book.
Our book, Cooperation and Coercion, you can find on Amazon and the Audible version on Audible. And if you'd like to see, I have several hundred educational videos on economics and statistics and
Your
public
channel.
policy. My YouTube channel, YouTube/Antony Davies.
Thank you, my friend.
My pleasure.
This
Thank
was
you.
Awesome. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely would love to have you come back.
Thank you.
All right, friends. We are out.
Hello, you're listening to the Eric McKenna Project.